Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sam Essick, and I'm a Regional Vice President and Partner with Hammes Company. I will be moderating today's webinar that focuses on the real estate issues hospitals need to address, including Stark and Anti-Kickback regulations, what is a cap rate, fair market value assessments, lease terms, broker relationships, and tools to manage a portfolio. Due to recent changes within the industry, hospital and healthcare leaders are facing constant demands on a smaller pool of available capital. The perception that healthcare facilities need to be owned and managed as part of a clinical care delivery platform is changing. Hospitals are now placing greater emphasis on their balance sheets, including turning a sharp eye on the performance of their real estate portfolios. This timely session, led by Ted Carson, Vice President of Real Estate Advisory Services for Hammes Company, will outline the best practices hospitals should adopt across their portfolio while maintaining the organization's overall mission. Ted will share several case studies where he has strategically assessed their real estate in a way that is not only efficient and economical, but also in alignment with their overall organization's long-term strategic plan and mission. All attendees are currently muted to avoid background noise. Should you have any questions or comments for our presenters during the webinar, please utilize the questions feature in your webinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will try to address all questions toward the end of the webinar. Ted has over 15 years experience providing commercial real estate services in the healthcare sector as well as other industries. Past clients have ranged from providers like Sparrow Health, St. Anthony's Medical Center, Scottsdale Healthcare, and Baptist Health System, to corporate clients like IBM, Bank of America, and Motorola. His work with non-healthcare clients has become increasingly valuable as hospitals continue to place greater emphasis on efficiency and cost effectiveness while pursuing ambulatory strategies and other emerging initiatives.
Thanks, Sam. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Ted Carson, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you this afternoon or this morning, as the case may be, wherever you're sitting. As the title of our webinar indicates, this is a 100-level course. It's a discussion geared toward those who, up until now, have had limited exposure to commercial real estate transactions. And because of this, Sam and I thought it would be helpful at the outset to just review a few common real estate terms and definitions that we think are important for you to understand. But please bear with us if you're already familiar with some of these terms, because we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about some general real estate techniques and tools and concepts that we've seen progressive healthcare organizations utilize as they've sought to improve the acquisition and management of their real estates. And just as a preview, some of the themes that we're going to touch on include technology and how you can use it to better manage your real estate portfolio. We're going to talk about prototyping and why that concept has moved into the healthcare facility arena and why we think it can bring value to healthcare organizations. And then we're also going to spend a few minutes talking about the perspective of the MOB developer. So let's try and, again, frame. Let's go back to that slide, Andrea, if you don't mind. I'd like to just spend a minute putting some perspective on why real estate is becoming more and more important to healthcare organizations. And as we all are aware, our industry is changing, and the movement towards population management and closed networks is going to require that all health systems provide more and more access points to wider and wider patient populations, but they're going to have to do so in an extremely cost-effective manner. And I firmly believe that well-positioned healthcare facility networks that are efficiently run and maintained are going to be fundamental to any organization that hopes to successfully navigate this paradigm shift. So now that we've framed why real estate is important to the future success and efficiency of a healthcare organization, let's talk about some real estate fundamentals. And let's go to the next slide. So these are the first of the three definitions that we're going to run through. Capitalization rate, commonly known as cap rate. You will hear this term utilized when talking about income properties and the valuation of those properties. And as the formula at the bottom of the page shows, a cap rate is found by dividing the operating income, the net operating income that a property produces by its cost. And as we kind of reflect back to our grade school and high school algebra days, if you know two of the three variables in an equation, you can find and solve for the third. So I think this is a cap rate. This concept of a cap rate is important for you to understand, and it's important for you to be familiar with this formula, because if you know what the proposed operating income is, and you know generally what the cost to develop a building is, then you can determine if that proposed income or that proposed rental rate that's being offered to you it results in a good cap rate. Because as we're going to talk in this next slide, your organization, based on its creditworthiness and economic situation, has its own cap rate. And cap rates, as this graphic shows, work in tandem with risk level, and they move together. And conversely, cap rates and property values move in opposite directions. And when I talk about risk level, that's also a proxy for typically the credit. So when a real estate investor is looking at an investment opportunity, they're very, very interested in the credit of the tenant and what type of risk level that tenant's credit gives to an investment opportunity. So if we're looking at our example in the graphic, a net property income, depending on the cap rate, can produce very different property values. We're still all using consistently in these three examples a net property income of $100,000 a year, but depending on the type of tenant, if you have a tenant with great credit and that risk level is low, they will generate a low cap rate, which pushes property values higher. Correspondingly, if you have a tenant with suspect, moderate, or even high levels of risk, their cap rate will move higher in association with the higher risk level produced, and that will degrade the property value. Let's go to the next slide and talk about why that's important. In reality, a tenant could pay less in rent than another but provide more value to a landlord, and that's because they have superior credit. So let's look at the two examples, and recalling back to what our formula is to derive property value. We take our annual rent and we divide it by our cap rate, and we come up with our property value. So here we have two examples with different rents, but the lower rent actually produces more property value because the risk for the investor is lower. We've got a lower cap rate, which again equates to lower risk, investment risk. So tenant A, because of their superior credit, produces a lower cap rate, and so even though they are paying a lower rent, they're providing more value to that landlord. And again, to sum this up, we think it's important for you to understand your organization's cap rate, how the investment community would view your tenancy when you're negotiating with landlords.
So Ted, are you suggesting that a hospital with a strong credit rating would be able to pay a lower rent than some other commercial user that might be competing for the same retail space where you might want to put a clinic?
That is definitely a possibility, and so when you're negotiating with landlords, you need to be cognizant of the value that you are creating for that property owner, and then you need to make sure that, you know, obviously the landlord is in business to make money, but you can more effectively manage their yield and keep more of your money on your side of the table if you're aware of the cap rate and the value that you're going to create for a property owner. Okay, let's go to the next slide and talk about our second term. Real estate in this country is calculated on a square foot basis, but there are a couple different types of square footages. There's a couple different types of definitions. So let's look at our space plan. And the green space represents your tenant suite, the four walls, and that's the space that you physically occupy. But if you notice and that's called your usable square footage. However, if you notice on the space plan, there's some yellow space. And that yellow space represents the common areas. And those spaces are shared by all tenants. And that includes the building lobby. It includes the common corridors that are used to access tenant suites. And it includes vertical transportation areas, stairwells and elevator shafts. And the landlord needs to allocate those common areas amongst the tenants, the various tenants in the building. And those common areas are allocated proportionally. And when you add your proportionate share of those common area elements, of those yellow areas, to your green usable area, you have your rentable square footage. And the conversion rate that's used to determine rentable to usable and then usable to rentable is called your gross up or your loss factor. And some buildings are very efficient, and so they have low gross up factors. And as a result, it's a more cost-effective environment. Comparably, some buildings are inefficient because they may have a very large lobby, they may have a very large atrium, and they may have very wide hallways. They have higher loss factors, so you're having to pay for more proportionate share of space.
I'd like to interject here as well, Ted. We have had clients, healthcare clients, that own their own real estate, particularly with older buildings where they are leasing space on a usable square foot basis. And it's created challenges for them in the market because the commercial market typically rents space on a rentable square foot basis. And the physicians are not comparing apples to apples.
And let's go to the next slide to show what Sam's talking about. If you look at the gross rents that are indicated on the usable basis, they're much higher. And if a potential tenant does not have an appreciation of the differences between usable and rentable, you're going to be perceived as much higher than market. Additionally, the reason that we want to call to your attention rentable versus usable is as your space programming. Very frequently, since many systems are still acute care focused and they work on the departmental gross square footages, they are not necessarily contemplating the need to add in that gross up factor when they're exploring spaces in a multi-tenant environment. So you can see the difference between rentable and usable square footage.
Yeah, that clearly would be a disadvantage if a hospital is still leasing space on a usable basis and a physician is shopping that space. Look at the higher operating expenses and the higher base rent. It's really pretty significant, so it's going to be harder for you to lease that. I do know that Ted, his group, has done some studies for hospitals where they've helped to do a conversion. So if you need help and want to convert your property, that is something that can be done working with an architect or an organization like ours.
Why don't we go to the next slide, and this is our last set of definitions, and then we'll get into hopefully some of the more exciting this portion of our discussion. There are different types of lease rates, or different types of ways to present rental rates, rather. So the triple net, very frequently known as, you'll see it written as NNN, 3 capital N's. That is when the tenant is paying just base rent, and then the operating expenses and taxes are paid separately. Versus a gross lease, that's when the tenant pays one single rental rate, and included in that rental rate is the tenant's share of operating expenses and taxes. And one of the reasons we wanted to really specifically call out this terminology, even though it may seem very, very fundamental, is because of the potential pitfall that we very frequently see health systems get into when they're structuring their leases with their physician tenants. They structure gross leases. And it's easy to understand why the physicians want to know certainty what their rent is, and they don't like the variability that's associated with a triple net lease. However, the pitfall emerges, and we're going to talk about this in a second, as it relates to Stark compliance. Gross leases, because they don't allow easily for the pass-through and the escalation of operating expenses and taxes, very frequently fall out of compliance with fair market value mandates under Stark regulations. And let's talk about this on the next slide. So any conversation about healthcare real estate wouldn't be complete unless we just very quickly touched on Stark compliance. and Anti-Kickback regulations. Hopefully you're aware of these regulations and what they mean as it relates to real estate. Stark regulations are designed to prohibit compensation in exchange for patient referrals. And the risks for noncompliance are significant and severe, including potential personal criminal penalties. There are multiple examples of fines for noncompliance. One of the most well-known and significant was a $30 million fine leveled against a Midwest health system that was the result of missing or not fully signed leases, and almost all of their leases were gross leases, and they were very dated leases, and over a 10-year period of time, if you're not accounting for the increase in operating expenses and real estate taxes, your gross lease will very quickly fall out of compliance from a fair market value perspective. And let's talk on the next slide more specifically about what are the requirements to be compliant with Stark. Stark, again, applies from a real estate perspective to non-employed physician leases and even certain ancillary leases, anywhere there's a referral relationship between the hospital and the tenant. Stark compliant leases have to be in writing. They have to be fully signed by both parties. Very frequently we see file cabinets full of leases that are signed by the hospital, but the physician has never gotten around to signing them, and that is a Stark violation. And as I'm going to talk about, there are no minor violations. Stark operates under a legal principle of strict compliance. So, there are no minor violations, and all the violations are treated equally and receive the same severe penalties. Additionally, leases have to be a minimum term length of at least 1 year, and the business terms have to be commercially reasonable. And you'll hear the term fair market value. We recommend that health systems, whenever they enter into a lease, conduct an independent third-party fair market value analysis, and we stress the operative word here is independent. The OIG, who reviews Stark compliance, responds much more favorably to independent fair market value analyses. Let's go to the next page. Thank you. We talked about some of the egregious Stark compliance issues, such as not having a signed lease or not having a fair market value rental rate, but there are a lot of other lesser known Stark pitfalls, but because of the strict compliance concept, these are treated just as severely as what would be maybe a more deliberate or egregious Stark violation. I view these kind of as oversights, but again, they're treated just as severely. And one example at the bottom is not charging for unused timeshare allotments. Very frequently we see health systems leasing out medical office building space to physicians on a daily or weekly basis, and if Dr. Smith has signed up for the timeshare suite every Tuesday and Thursday, and they are not utilizing, maybe they didn't utilize their space on 3 Thursdays that month, and you do not charge for that time, that is a Stark violation. And it's a challenge to maintain positive physician relationships, but the penalties are severe enough that you need to be understanding of the Stark compliance issues. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So of all the items that we're going to touch on today, and I know we're throwing a lot at you, and we really wanted to just present a variety of topics here, and you'll identify which ones are intriguing to you, and you can research them on your own. We wanted to make you aware of just a lot of different concepts, but this is probably, in my mind, the one that can create the most value for a health system. So if you take anything away from this discussion today, it's the value that a lease administration or property management technology platform can bring to your organization. These are very low-cost investments, and they create a tremendous amount of value almost immediately. They help with compliance. They help you move from a reactive decision-making state to a more strategic and proactive decision-making state. They can even help with tenant relationships. So let's go to the next slide. and talk a little bit more specifically about how we've seen lease administration systems provide tremendous value to health systems. As I mentioned, they support compliance efforts. These systems will automatically calculate and bill the operating expense pass-throughs to tenants. So you're not dependent upon a human being to remember to charge the physician tenant for those operating expense pass-throughs, because quite frequently, sometimes people just forget. These systems do it automatically. These systems allow you to have more insight into how you're spending your real estate expenses and where you're incurring real estate expenses. Once you start to track expenses, you can start to improve upon them. So this allows you to start tracking your expenses, and then you can start managing your expenses better. One example of how they allow you to do that is they make lease audits very, very, very easy to conduct. And we recommend, depending on the size of your portfolio, at a minimum every 3 years, if not 2, or depending on the size of the portfolio, you could justify doing a lease audit annually.
Ted, would you recommend this for hospitals that have already sold their real estate and are currently not managing real estate, or is it really just for those that have a portfolio?
Yes, I think you can benefit even if you're primarily a tenant in your real estate, and we'll share a case study towards the end of our conversation about how a health system that had already monetized their entire portfolio adopted the lease administration system and identified some significant cost savings as a result of implementing that technology. And one of the areas that I can't stress enough that I think a lease administration system helps is in it promotes strategic decision making, and it's hard to quantify and put a dollar amount on the savings and the benefit that generates, but by allowing multiple departments within an organization to see the same information, it reduces silos, it promotes more efficient, and you're working off of complete knowledge, and it also allows you to start reacting well ahead of time to when you need to make decisions. You should really, in my opinion, have a plan for every asset that you have for the next 36 months. Every critical lease date that you should have an understanding of what you're tentatively planning. Now, those plans can change, certainly, but a lease administration system allows you to start identifying your critical dates. They're on everybody's radar. You have dashboards that you can look off of, and you can see well in advance, and everyone in your organization can see what are some of the decision points that are coming up. Okay. And these lease systems, there's a variety of them, as Sam mentioned, as we talked about. It doesn't matter if you're a tenant-focused portfolio, if you're primarily a landlord, large portfolio, small portfolio, they're very much customizable. There's about 30 of them out there. These are just a few of them that we've presented here. We've worked with all of these. There's a lease administration system out there for you at fairly low cost. Let's go to the next slide if you don't mind. Thanks. As we're moving more and more into the ambulatory environment, we're working more and more with local real estate brokers. Local real estate brokers provide a tremendous amount of value. They have tremendous insight into the workings of your local real estate market, but I think it's important that you work with them the right way. And what I mean by that is don't have it be a one-way street, and don't have it be a passive relationship with your broker. You should not allow your broker to only provide you sites that are available and limit your universe of potential opportunities to sites that are, quote, on the market, either for lease or purchase. Ideally, what I think you should do, especially because of the level of capital that we're potentially investing in replacement hospital campuses or large ambulatory facilities, you should identify the ideal optimal site regardless of whether it's available or not. So don't limit yourself to sites that have a sign on them and are for sale or are for lease. Very, very frequently we work with clients and we help them identify the best site, and we don't even know if it's for sale or not. Once we've identified those sites, then we determine if there's a strategy that we can implement to make those sites available, and whether it is assembling 30 different parcels for a new hospital campus. We helped the hospital buy 30 different homes for a new hospital campus in suburban Chicago. When we started, we just knew that the hospital needed to be located in that particular area. Not a single one of those houses was for sale when we started to assemble them over an 18-month period. Or a large ambulatory facility that we helped a hospital develop in suburban St. Louis, it ended up being located on the site of a golf course. And when we did our market search, we realized that that was the best location for that particular property. And so we approached the property owner of that golf course. He was not aware that his property was for sale when we did our site search. So, and then don't underestimate the value of anonymity. Landlords, property owners, when they hear that a health system is interested in their site, they very frequently start to get dollar signs in their eyes. And you are well served at the beginning of your negotiations utilizing a straw purchaser or making sure that your broker is keeping everything anonymous. It'll help you control costs throughout the negotiation. And I just want to call your attention to a couple of those logos. Those are electronic databases that you can access either for free or fairly low cost that will allow you to kind of get some of the same information that your local broker would have. And one in particular is called Revista. I'm particularly interested to see what this database is like. It's brand new. It's actually launching this summer. You can go onto their website and sign up, and it is unique because it's specifically focused on medical office properties. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. A few additional criteria to consider when evaluating locations. I always like to plan for success. So look at your second phase on and try and envision it on a site and identify sites that have growth capacity and growth corridors. You're going to put a lot of work into developing your ambulatory network, and it's going to be hopefully very successful, and you don't want to limit yourself by not being able to expand those locations at some point in the future. Other thing to be mindful of is, especially as we're looking at adaptive reuse opportunities of existing commercial buildings and turning them into healthcare facilities, is being cognizant of the existing building infrastructure. Most commercial properties have mechanical systems that are not designed and sized to support healthcare use. So that could be very likely a hidden cost that you should try to identify earlier on in the process as you're evaluating different opportunities. Be aware of adjacent users. One example that comes to mind is a health system that we're familiar with that went into a shopping center and opened a clinic in a shopping center. Within that shopping center was a health club. As you could imagine, that health club during certain times of the day really stressed the parking load and made it very difficult to access that clinic from a parking perspective and made for a poor patient experience. As we mentioned, one of the goals is to identify all of your costs, and that is particularly important as you're looking at ground-up development. We kind of joke that some of the most expensive land that a health system can have is land that's free or donated. Very frequently, health systems are donated land. Well, you need to understand the true costs of that land from a utility improvement perspective, the soil conditions, environmental, etc., and build up towards a total cost of occupancy. So look at it beyond just core and shell construction costs. And I'll take that a step further. You need to understand the level of entitlement support that you're going to need from the municipality. Very often, healthcare uses require zoning variances, and that can open the door to the city or municipality charging you impact fees in exchange for their municipal approval, or it could even go to the extent of the municipality in exchange for their approval requiring pilot payment in lieu of taxes. So you should, again, build up towards your total cost of occupancy. It's very frequently beyond just simply core and shell construction costs. Let's go to our next slide. You've heard about prototyping. A lot of national retailers and banks use it. They use it to control their development costs. They use it to generate speed to market. But they also use it so that they can deliver a consistent customer experience. And in addition to the construction savings and the time savings that prototyping brings to a healthcare organization, it also brings that same consistency and that same standard operating model, which translates to increased heightened clinical care. And if you really look at some of the early healthcare prototype adopters, they are all systems that are known for high levels of clinical excellence. And why they were attracted to prototyping is because it allows them to deliver a standard model of care, which again correlates to high clinical levels of care. So let's talk again, or let's go to the next slide, and let's look at some of the cost increase factors in the development continuum. From project design, you can have, if you're designing every building from scratch, you've got a lot of user group customization. As you get into construction, if every building is different, you're exposing yourself to change orders. And then once you're operating at that last triangle, you can see the top cost increase factor is you're opening yourself up to a unique operating model. And I think that's the most significant cost increase factor because, as I mentioned earlier, you're delivering a different model of care, and that's an ongoing cost. It's not a one-time cost like change orders. If you have variability in your operating model, that variability lasts throughout the life of the property. Cost savings potential, though, that we've seen from systems that have adopted prototyping, AE fees up to 20% reduction, project schedules are reduced by 15%, 5 to 10% construction cost savings. That project schedule also, a lot of the savings is not just on your physical construction, but it's really achieved in your project design phase because you've got limited user group interaction. And if the facility directors that we've worked with that have employed prototyping were honest, they would comment that the best advantage of utilizing prototyping is it really limits your user group interaction. User group input is received as you're developing your prototype model, but once that model is set, and if you're consistent with it, you really don't need a lot of user group interaction there on out.
Ted, I can easily see how prototyping would be a benefit for a ground-up development. Can you explain how it's used when you're out leasing, especially in the ambulatory environment, and looking at a retail space?
Sure. The way we develop the prototypes with our clients is it's on a modular basis, what we call a kit of parts. And one of the advantages of having that prototype is it allows you to very quickly test fit, and you literally lay over that module into an existing condition site plan. And you can very quickly see if an existing site is able to support your prototype. Let's go to the next slide. So we're almost done, and we're going to quickly get into the case studies, but I just wanted to touch briefly on just a few talking points on the MOB developer perspective. The current trend right now in healthcare real estate is that there's a tremendous compression or downward pressure on cap rates. And so as you recall from the beginning of our conversation, as cap rates decline, building values are increasing. So the value of healthcare properties has increased significantly over the last year to a year and a half. For example, fully leased, on-campus, trophy assets with high credit, high investment grade, which again correlates to low risk, which again correlates to low cap rates, are trading at sub-6. A year and a half ago, they were in the 7 range. So a compression of 100 basis points is extremely significant in a short period of time. There's a premium for on-campus properties and a premium for properties that are master leased where the entire building is leased by a health system. So the investment community will pay more, slightly more, not significantly more, but slightly more for an on-campus property versus a property that's out in the community. We would recommend, as you're having conversations with developers, that don't start your negotiations by negotiating on a square foot rent. Identify and negotiate off of a rental constant, because ultimately what you're going to want to do to get the most value is you're going to want to go to an open book process. And so once you have an open book process, the development budget will be what the development budget is, and you will just have negotiated off of what is an appropriate yield or return on that development budget for the developer. It's important, though, when you are working on an open book, that early on in the process you have a clear definition of what is and what is not included in that, quote, open book. For example, should you allow the developer to have a return on its equity during the construction period? That's just a negotiating point, but you should know up front, and you should define that up front. What is your definition of open book? Another example, there's a variety of another example would be the developer fee. What is an appropriate developer fee? That should be defined up front, and how that's included in your open book. And the last thing that I'm going to leave you with is the lease versus own analysis. We very, very frequently have conversations with health systems in which they make the comment that, well, of course we should own a building because we as a health system can borrow at a lower interest rate than a developer. And that's almost universally true, that you can borrow at a lower rate. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should own, because what you need to contemplate is what's called your WACC, your weighted average cost of capital. And that includes the opportunity cost of the equity that you're going to have to insert into a development project. Gone are the days of 100% financing where you don't have to insert equity into a project. Even health systems that have great credit are being required by their financing sources to keep equity in a project in the 30 to 40% level sometimes. And so as a result, if you have 30% of equity of a project budget in the form of equity, there's an opportunity cost. You could be investing that equity elsewhere. You could be utilizing it to expand a cardiology practice. It could be used to renovate your ORs that would create an incremental lift in your revenue. So you need to understand how much equity are you going to need to leave in a project, what that means to your WACC, what's your opportunity cost, and then you can compare that to the cost that the landlord would lease the building to you from. Okay. We're almost done, so thanks for hanging in there. We've got 3 case studies. The first case study talks about, again, the value of a lease administration system. This is a St. Louis area hospital, very small portfolio, only 7 buildings. They had monetized it, so they didn't even own it, but they were tenants. They wanted to just have the lease administration system so that they could track their critical dates. But what they found is that this helped them audit the operating expense pass-throughs that the landlord was charging, and they, within 6 months of implementing this system, they identified over $500,000 in cost savings from. They realized they weren't direct billing for utility recovery. That was identified as we reviewed the leases to abstract them, to put them into the system. There was an emergency generator cost recovery that the landlord was not paying to the hospital. So there were a variety of cost-saving credits and recoveries that we helped identify, and it was only because of utilizing this lease administration system. Let's go to the next case study. This is for a hospital in Westchester County, and we worked with them to help them determine whether they should lease or own a new on-campus MOB. And so what we did, as we just discussed a few minutes ago, we helped them understand the alternative investment opportunities that they could deploy their capital into versus putting it into a medical office building. Physician practice expansion, for this instance, it actually was an OR expansion, and we helped them model what revenue could be generated by investing that equity elsewhere, and then we were able to compare it to what it would cost them to lease the MOB. And it turned out that they felt for this organization at this particular time, it was appropriate for them to lease the MOB. And so once that decision was made, we helped direct an RFP process. We helped to identify which developer candidates should be included in the process. And so we looked beyond economics, and some of the selection criteria that were non-quantifiable included we wanted to find a developer that had a track record in success in working with the physician community to provide investment opportunities, because the hospital saw this medical office building as an alignment tool. And so they wanted to make sure their physicians had investment opportunities. They wanted to make sure a developer was fluent on the latest operating models, because they wanted to make sure that this building was highly efficient. And they also were very concerned about the developer had a successful tenant relationship track record. Let's go to the last case study. We worked with a health system in the Phoenix area, and what we did is we worked with their local broker. So we did a market survey, an ambulatory network plan that identified a pocket of opportunity. And once we identified that pocket of opportunity, the local broker helped identify about 30 different locations within this submarket. But as you recall, one of my recommendations was don't limit yourself to available sites. And so I spent a couple of days driving the market with this broker and pointed to about 8 additional properties that were not formally on the market. So we increased our universe of potential opportunities to 38. That broker knocked on doors and actually found one of these property owners that was willing to sell, and that was the location that we ultimately selected. So the takeaway then is don't limit yourself to a universe of only sites that are available that have for lease or for sale sites. Find the right location and then figure out a strategy to make it available. So that concludes our webinar. I hope I've given a few minutes back, but let's just spend I think we've got a couple questions that have come in, and I'll try and answer those quickly.
Sure, and if any of you have questions that are listening to the webinar, please utilize the question feature in your webinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And it appears that we have a few questions coming in here. Here's one, the first one. Ted, our hospital wants to rent space in a medical office building that is owned by a local physician group. The rent seems high to me. How do I document that the rate we'll be paying is a fair market value?
Well, we would recommend an independent fair market value study in a local real estate firm or an appraiser, or even law firms can provide those. So that's the first recommendation, and make sure that study is looking at some of the terms that we talked about, rentable to usable. Make sure tenant improvement allowances are included, and make sure that the type of lease is addressed in that fair market value study.
Okay. Here's another question. Our health system leases space from a landlord who sends us a bill at the end of each year for operating expenses. How do I know if these expenses are accurate, since there is little or no backup to support the invoice?
It sounds like this is a candidate for a lease audit. You need to review your leases, and typically the audit provisions are spelled out, and very frequently you've got a window of time from when the landlord provides your operating expenses to complete that audit. The landlord needs to provide you with that backup, and then you can benchmark that data against regional indexes that can tell you whether those operating expenses are in alignment with market rates.
Okay. If we want to hire a national real estate investor to build us a clinic, what criteria is best to use so we compare apples to apples in our selection of a firm?
Well, what you need to work towards is understanding the developer's cost of capital, because what you're going to want to set up is a transaction that's based on an open book, and so you're not negotiating a rental rate, you're going to negotiate on a rental constant. And then we kind of briefly touched on that earlier. So what you're really wanting to focus on is what is the developer's cost of capital. Also, just be mindful that when you're looking and analyzing developer candidates, as we talked about, healthcare real estate is an incredibly hot commodity right now, and that's promoting a lot of developers and owners of real estate to sell properties. So you need to analyze the possibility that you'll have a different landlord shortly after the project's developed, and whether you're comfortable with that. Some developers will commit to owning and retaining the property for a determined period of time. And I think that's important because of the impact that a landlord can have on tenant relationship, and how critical it is to maintain positive relationships with your tenant physicians.
Ted, we have a question that says we have less than 25 locations. Is there a lease administration system that is right for us? Can we justify the expense with so few properties?
Yes, that is a small portfolio, but you can find systems that you can implement for between $15,000 and $25,000. That's a one-time cost, and then the annual. I think this one that I'm thinking of in particular, the annual cost is less than $8,000, and it may be as low as $5,000 a year. So, I absolutely would encourage you to explore and investigate systems out there.
Okay. Determining fair market value rents is challenging for us because there is a limited supply of medical office buildings in our surrounding area. How do we make sure that our rents are fair market value?
This is common. Very frequently, a health system kind of dominates the market, so to speak. They account for the bulk, if not all, of the market. So it's troublesome when you're determining the fair market. And what I would suggest in that case is always utilize a third party, but you can find other geographies that are comparable. And for example, Macon, Georgia, there is a large system that dominates that market, and they really have about 95% of the medical office building market under their control. So what they've done is they've started to look at Savannah and Augusta, Georgia, comparable sized markets, geographically proximate. So you can approach it that way.
What is the typical lease term for an ambulatory clinic? We have a landlord proposing a 20-year term for a new development. We talk with systems a lot about this, and I think you need to find the right balance between lease commitment. Because the longer the lease term, the more tenant improvement dollars that the landlord is typically willing to provide. So if you did a 5-year term, the landlord's only going to be willing to provide a limited amount of dollars. However, if you extend that term, the landlord is able to significantly increase the tenant improvement package, which allows you to lower your out-of-pocket capital costs. So I would think that you need to look at, is this a new, from a strategic standpoint, is this a new venture? Is this an unproven venture? You may not want to commit to 20 years. If you're just relocating within a market that you already have a proven track record, then maybe a longer term is appropriate. It'll allow you to lower your out-of-pocket costs. Well, thank you, Ted. That concludes our webinar. We appreciate all of you listening in, and hope that you will join us again for future topics that we will be discussing in the coming months. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.